My name is Max Gagliardi, and we're here live with co-host David Heikkinen for this week's episode of Talk.Energy Insights on January 21, 2022. We've got Nick Kracov here. Thanks, Nick, for joining us.
Yeah, we're going to talk some carbon today. So,
hey, gentlemen, happy to be here. Thanks for having
me.
Nick, your company's Molecule Ventures, right?
Correct.
Awesome. Right. Well, we've got a ton to cover here, and there's a lot of it's a really interesting topic, and Hike has been way more down the rabbit hole in the carbon markets. But I think the easiest way to start it is just for the person who doesn't really understand it, just a high-level overview, and then we can dive into the details.
Yeah, sure. So I think something that is important to distinguish when talking about carbon is the difference between, people use this broad term carbon credits, right? And you have to really separate what you're talking about. You have carbon allowances, which are regulatory fiat in these cap and trade paradigms implemented by, states, countries, et cetera. And then you have carbon offsets, which are instruments that can be generated by certain activities that create a voluntary instrument. Some of these voluntary instruments can be used within compliance programs, but I think that kind of the broad discussion that you see in kind of major media doesn't really do a good job of breaking that down. So that's the kind of two worlds you have coexisting in carbon.
So the credits themselves are more like real tangible things versus the offsets are more, there's more ambiguity. Is that a better way to think of it?
I would say more that the carbon allowances are instruments used for compliance under a regulatory paradigm, whereas voluntary is typically for corporate initiatives or, offsetting or sometimes marketing.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So Nick, can you just take a step back and kind of introduce yourself, like introduce Molecule Ventures, what y'all are doing, when you were formed, kind of what's changed over the last couple of years? That'd be helpful. Just to ground us in that.
For sure. So I actually got my career started in carbon environmental markets. I was a researcher at a company called Environmental Financial Products. It's an office of Dr. Richard Sandor, who's prolific financial derivatives pioneer. He wrote the first interest rate futures contracts and kind of took that skill set to the environment in the early 90s. He was involved in drafting the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And from there, he designed the acid rain program. He launched the first kind of carbon market, legally binding but voluntary program through the Chicago Climate Exchange. And I was helping him update a book called Environmental Markets and Sustainable Investing. And there I looked at everything from the EU's regulated market to Icelandic fishery quota trading. So a pretty wide range of commoditization of environmental assets. And from there, I spent a few years in more tangible boots on the ground work. I was a renewable and natural gas project developer at a company called Invenergy out of Chicago and IPP. And then I did a master's degree in New York in sustainability, where I met my current partners in Molecule Ventures. They're former long-short equity guys from Wall Street, and we're looking to kind of make a transition towards the energy transition. And they were introduced to the California carbon market, which had, at the time, this amazing asymmetry where prices were along this regulatory floor that's in place to ensure a rising price and kind of push investment towards lower carbon processes. And, the single opportunity combined with the broader tailwinds behind carbon as an asset class kind of pushed us and compelled us to start a business. So we launched in June 2020 with internal capital, and we now manage over $350 million across two different strategies focused on compliance and voluntary carbon.
That was helpful. Should have started with that. Thank you, David, for having him have the intro.
Yeah, can you talk about, like, California's kind of led the way for the U.S. around policy, and so you started there. Can you just talk about what you mean by how does the price escalate? Like, what is I'm really trying to ground this in a 101 level.
Sure. So the allowances, carbon instruments themselves, are issued via quarterly auctions, and each year there's an auction floor price. That's the minimum clearing price of these auctions, where covered emitters have to purchase these allowances. And covered emitters change by program. So in California, it covers about 75% of the economy. Anyone who emits over 25,000 metric tons per year has to purchase and hand in these allowances. And so that's everything from transportation fuels, natural gas, power sector. And essentially the allowance, the auction floor price steps up 5% plus CPI annually, as does these reserve tiers, where if prices rise to a certain level, they'll release additional supply.
Mm-hmm.
So back in 2020, prices were, the allowances also trade on the secondary market via ICE futures, and secondary market and auction clearing prices were around this floor. So when you looked at the supply demand curve in these kind of highly analyzable markets where you know the trajectory of supply, how many allowances the regulator is going to issue over the next 10 years, these caps that are set, right? Decreasing caps to force emissions lower. And you look at the trajectory of demand, emissions, and you know that emissions are much stickier, right? You have caps falling at 4.4% per year. And you look at historical emissions, when you take out the coal that's come off the grid, emissions had only come off, 0.2% per year over the past 5-6 years. And so we saw this kind of imbalance where demand was going to outstrip supply over the next 5 years. And in commodity markets, price typically leads a true shortage. And so we just saw this amazing downside protection through this floor where emitters will be forced to return to buy additional supply to recover what they handed in. And, your upside all the way towards these reserve tiers that are multiples above where it was trading.
Yep.
And
so the size of the market, one of the other things that I think people, it's not a large market, and then having that ownership, like what's the way to get exposure? How'd you do it?
Yeah, well, there are a couple ways to get exposure. You can play it through futures only, which is just basically go long the longer dated futures and roll those out over time. But there's also a kind of more cumbersome process where they invite voluntary participants into the market for price discovery and liquidity purposes. And those players are subject to a holding limit, the number of physical allowances you can own, which is at cost now around, while we're trading at around $30, it's about 300 million in terms of fund size of what you could own. But and when you are a registered participant, you can also participate in auctions. You can trade through futures and acquire that way.
So you guys were a registered participant in the market and actually, are a voluntary, like you're not one of the emitters that is doing, like you're effectively providing liquidity and went through that process a couple of years ago.
That's right. And part of the motivation for that, as we all remember, March 2020, we launched in June and we're sitting there watching, prices trade through that floor. Yeah. And it was kind of a double-edged sword, right? We saw the resilience of the market because in a couple of weeks, prices had recovered right back up to that auction floor. But at the same time, considering if you wanted to go a future strategy, that kind of leverage risk really came back in some people's faces. So we really kind of gave us some conviction in our physical approach to these markets.
Yeah, negative crude oil did that to some people too. Whenever things go below floors, it's some unusual things happened in March to June of 2020. So
certainly, but we're definitely happy we pushed ahead.
Yeah. So got active in the California markets. Where are you all located, just for perspective?
Yeah, we're based in New York.
Okay.
Based in New York City.
So when you thought about where you wanted to be, so you saw this structural opportunity in California. Now I've captured that. Is there additional opportunity in California? Do you think about low carbon fuel credits? Do you go beyond any other carbon, that carbon offsets that end up having different attributes than what you already participated in?
Yeah, it's worth mentioning, and this kind of is the interesting thing about all of these markets, right? Is a ton of pollution in California is the same as a ton of pollution in Canada, China, wherever. And so the California market is actually linked with Quebec, and the allowances are fungible between the two programs. And that's kind of just speaks to the global nature of carbon as an asset, right? Yeah. These markets all kind of have the potential to link in the future. The LCFS is very interesting. We have some kind of tangential investments, private investments related to the space, but it's that's a market that already had its five-fold rise.
Right.
And from 2015 to 2020, it went from 30 to 200.
Yep.
And there's a ceiling in that market as well. So, but never say never. The regulators in California are considering increasing the carbon intensity targets of that program, and so it could certainly become interesting again.
Yep.
How do you think it drives, from what you've seen in the markets, how is it driving behavior around, what companies are doing? I mean, obviously they're just having to get access to more. The demand is not there. The supply is not there versus the demand. Do we see any other types of trends in terms of behaviors in these states and the way that companies are navigating this? Or is it basically just, hey, you're doing business here, this is the system, and essentially your thesis is that you're going to have to continue to get access to abilities and ways to produce more carbon via these markets?
Yeah, well, the whole concept is to force emitters to kind of look at their compliance options, right? And consider, in my budget, would I rather invest in scrubbers or whatever technology to reduce my emissions, or look at my kind of 5-year expected compliance costs to buy these allowances under this program?
Right.
And so, that project implementation timelines and this program having been around 7-8 years now, we're starting to see the results of those investments, of having been forced to look at those options. But it's not something that happens overnight. You look at California's own modeling of the transportation sector. There was a report that came out late last year from the California Energy Commission that compared a business as usual scenario under their current transportation policies and a low carbon scenario that would get to net zero emissions in the transportation sector by 2045. And you see that the real downturn in emissions really doesn't come until the 2030s, but all the investments have to be made now. So, and cap and trade, these carbon markets are just, one more lever that the regulator has to pull to force things in that direction.
How does it do you model out do you understand the cost? Do you guys look at the costs around the compliance, like you said, via the scrubbers or whatever other methods that this market could use outside of the compliance or the credits? Or is there a breakover point? Because we talk about hikes always hey, really long or bullish carbon, but where do you start to see the decision points changing, or is that something that's even able to model? Is it too complex, or am I thinking about that right?
No, you are definitely. There's some kind of, obviously it's different plant by plant and technology by technology and sector by sector, but you definitely have some kind of leading indicators, right? You can look at cost of capture for natural gas power generation, that's in the 60s, 70s. You can look at, cement capture, industrial capture, that's all in the 40s, 50s. And then you it's definitely much more complicated math in transportation, right? Of going from a lot more factors to include of gasoline to electric. And that's really the one feasible pathway is either reducing vehicle miles traveled or, switching fuel source. And that's, doesn't have an easily comparable dollar per ton figure, but that's kind of the shift in thinking, and the common denominator is dollar per ton. What is the dollar per ton cost where it is more economical to invest in the alternative production or generation pathway versus just complying by purchasing allowances?
Yep. So Nick, you talked about the global nature of carbon. You have your stock in the atmosphere, the geosphere, and then you have the flow of what we're emitting every year. Can you talk through, as you looked at all the markets, it seems like you're doing some expansion thinking now. Could you just give the listener an idea of what are the different places they could look? Where is carbon traded? I'm just thinking of Europe, and we have, like you said, you have the futures curve. You have things like I personally own, just for full disclosure, GRN and KRBN. And so there are opportunities, in the market to own some duration and attributes there. But can you just talk us through, for a complete newbie, when you started looking at, the economic impact of trying to offset emissions? And Max and I are both fossil guys and believe that, the fact that breaking carbon and hydrogen chemical bonds and generating electricity with it is one of the best stores. Well, when you do that, you emit, and so we think that the solution is some combination of some capture in the future, and so it just makes sense. So can you talk about global markets? Just give it the comment of California, Quebec being linked. Just give us a 101 of.
Yeah. I think the history is helpful too,
Yeah,
right? So
perfect.
The kind of concept of being able to trade your emissions came out of the Kyoto Protocol, and that was, in the recent Glasgow COP meetings, you heard a lot of talk about offsets in Article 6. Article 6 is what was born out of Kyoto and what basically gave member countries the ability to say, okay, I will pay this project developer in the Philippines and attribute those emissions reductions there to my goal, right, that I set here. And that was ratified in 97. And coming out of that, the EU ETS was born and launched in 2005. And that was the first major kind of regulatory compliance market where you had a declining cap set over time. And that was followed in 2009 by the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast, covers the power sector. And then California in 2012. And we just really kind of just saw a steady uptick in these markets being born. And, they're all, like I was saying before, kind of subject to different sector coverage and different levels of ambition, right? Of how fast the caps come down and where the regulators are trying to drive it. But I guess I didn't really touch on your question about how to get exposure.
No, you don't have to yet. Really just the 101 of how things started. And I've actually gone back even a little further to like cap and trade systems that worked around, NOx and SOx, and really kind of thinking about the old acid rain problems. And that actually really was a fundamental sustained and successful process. Seems like you could have the same thing emerge in the carbon side, but really the EU start was a failure. Basically, prices you didn't have the economic growth that was built into the model, and so the pricing didn't actually function. I don't know if you want to give any of that history, given your background. It might be helpful for people to understand.
I think the EU kind of had a double whammy happen, right? Where the global financial crisis suppressed emissions more than anyone foresaw when regulators were setting the caps.
Yep.
And so you had a lot of the member states just, economic activity go flatline. And so there was just a massive oversupply in the market. And that part of that was compounded by the fact that at the time, the EU allowed a portion of compliance obligations to be satisfied using these voluntary instruments from coming out of the Kyoto Protocol, the Clean Development Mechanism, and CERs, they were called, Certified Emissions Reductions. And, that's something that a lot of people are hyper-focused on now, is standardization of those instruments and putting some integrity behind them. But at the time, it was complete Wild West. Like there are stories of HFC facilities being built just to destroy the HFCs they produced because the economics of destroying the offset were worth it. And so that kind of flooded the EU and suppressed prices, at €5 for 5+ years. And then a trend that we're seeing across kind of all compliance carbon is regulators stepped in and implemented kind of market stability mechanisms that have really improved the investability of these markets, right? In the EU, you have something called the Market Stability Reserve that says if supply is above X, if the circulating supply is above X, we'll withhold this number of instruments from future supply. And you're seeing those crop up across other markets. Like recently, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative implemented something similar, where if auction clearing prices are at or below a certain level, we'll remove this amount of supply. And so that's just an amazing kind of concept that you don't get in many other commodity markets, where you have kind of supply mechanisms to buoy prices and keep the market doing what it's designed to do.
Because really, the incentive is trying to keep the price where people want to reduce emissions. I think and the thing that a lot of people miss is inside of plants, there's a whole lot of scope 1 and 2 efficiency that is done. Like, you don't have to go into direct air capture, capturing the carbon. You can, in the oil and gas space, you have a whole lot of, emissions around regulators that used to be natural gas that now they're making them either air, pneumatics, or electric. And so, like, the inside of a plant, you can dial up your efficiency and reduce your emissions. Inside of power plants, you can, basically combined cycle LNG, gas turbine, 60+% heat rates, and that level of efficiency versus a lot of the existing plants. You can do things to be less emissive that you can actually still capture some value around and so I think those long duration things are interesting in the measurement of where and what each plant or each emitter actually is. So just trying to help people understand this isn't just, cap and trade and some regulator, putting a floor on price. There's actually an embedded price, I think, of emissions, in a lot of our equities already.
Yeah, I think the clearest example of how carbon pricing comes into play is in the EU power markets, where the carbon price is sets the fuel switching price, right? Where you kind of change, depending on where carbon's trading, it might change the merit order of what gets dispatched, coal or natural gas. And that was kind of an amazing phenomenon we saw a couple months back, where as natural gas prices were rising, more coal was generating, which led to more purchases of allowances, which kind of propelled this short-term super cycle of a feedback loop where all the commodities surrounding the European power markets were rising.
Yep. Yeah, that was fun last year. If you
spicy, I'd say.
One thing I was going to ask, and this is just I don't even have any ability in my mind to frame this in terms of the results of these programs. Like, is there like a track record of, hey, look, we implemented this and, there was the effectiveness, I guess, like, is it able to be measured? How can we measure it? Like, I'm just wondering, like, as you think through these things,
good question.
I mean, how do we benchmark this stuff? How do we scorecard it, what these policies are doing or what these markets are doing? Is there any way to quantify that?
Yeah, I mean, there are regulator studies trying to do exactly that. And, it's when you have a soup of policies surrounding emissions reductions, it is hard to dissect what you attribute to, power sector, for example. What do you attribute to carbon markets versus renewable portfolio standards, versus just outright capacity procurement targets, And so it is definitely difficult, and there are studies looking at it. The EU has claimed some success. It's still kind of early innings in California, but a recent report from the National Bureau of Economic Research did attribute emissions reductions and kind of co-pollutant benefits in environmental justice communities to cap and trade, right? Fence line communities. But no, I agree. It is hard to pick apart, but it's, one solution in a kitchen sink worth of policies targeting, the change that they want to see. So
is it like, we've talked about this theme on the pod a lot, is this kind of like carbon leakage theme? Can they leak carbon to other areas to escape the jurisdiction? Like, if you're not in California, but you either go across state lines or to another country, are there ways to game this? I mean, could we end up in a world where, like, the Western world has, like, very, very reduced emissions, but they're all just higher somewhere else? Like, I mean, I don't know. These are like the big picture things that I try to think through. And again, this is someone who has like very little background in this. It's just like high level for me.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Yeah. Most of the compliance markets have obviously thought of, the risk of leakage, and there are mechanisms to, protect against that. Like, most markets have an allocation concept that's output based.
Right.
Where it says, if you produce X, you'll get X% of your emissions for free. Mm-hmm. Like in California, 70% are sold through auction and 30% are given to emitters for leakage prevention.
Interesting.
And that's kind of what's compelled the EU to start all these talks about carbon border adjustments, right? Is they're looking at their cost of production across energy and steel, and saying if we're going to be importing products that have such an advantage against the kind of prices we're imposing on our domestic production, we need to do something about that.
Yep.
That's interesting. We're like a third to halfway. Go ahead, keep going.
I was just going to say that there are also, built into the program ways to kind of prevent that, right? It's like transportation fuels. It's whoever owns it at the in-state terminal. It has the compliance obligation, right? So it doesn't matter if you shipped it in from another state. It's not like it can slip through the crack. Whoever
right
is the ultimate distributor. So
that's good. Well, David, to peg the conversation, we're like close to a little over a third or halfway close. I would love to hit on offsets, and I'd love to hit on CCUS as well, but I'll let you transition, Dave, if you have any more on this one.
No, I think it's an interesting setup of, and Max, I know we've talked about this in the past I think just to give you have a stock of carbon that's been emitted post the industrial age of like 1.6 trillion tons of CO2 equivalent. And like annually, we emit 40 billion tons per year. And so like the flow is where a lot of people focus. And there's a stock question of what's in the world already. And if you kind of hit on it a little bit, one of those fun facts, Max, I know we talked about, there was a compressor company in the oil field that was electrifying compressors, and essentially, Tesla has on their website that I think they've avoided 3.5 million tons of CO2 equivalent emitted in the history of the company. And they take credit for the life of car and, the offset of like how many ICE miles would be driven. And there's a lot of calculations that go into that. But I think just for an order of magnitude, just to give people an idea of size of markets, like one Lafarge cement plant emits like 2 million tons per annum.
Right.
It's like all of what Tesla has done. And that's great. I'm not dissing or saying anything bad about EV versus ICE, but like the size of the flow is really in a lot of making things, not in moving things.
Yeah.
And so like 35% of emissions globally are in cement and steel, 25% is electricity, 15% is transport, and then a lot of other, agriculture, land usage and that. So like from an order of magnitude of where just the carbon market is, you think about, trying to take carbon out of the atmosphere. If that's the goal, like I'm not going to argue climate or anything, but let's just say the goal is to stop 40 billion tons per year and reduce 1.6 trillion tons. We talk about like $80 a ton, like 40 billion per year at $80 a ton, like the amount of dollars traded and then the amount of capital costs to put those sinks in or reduce emissions. It's a huge size or total addressable market. And Nick, I don't know if you share those types of numbers or that kind of round number of why I think it's so interesting. It's just that combined with the fact that in cap and trade and in the markets, there isn't super good transparency either as far as how transactions happen. And I'll talk a little bit about attributes. You have a duration. So if you are emitting carbon, it goes into the world forever, essentially. Like it's out. A lot of the cap and trade and a lot of the voluntary markets are like deferring of like agricultural usage. Like you end up, almond trees last a little bit longer in California, and you have you buy an ability to emit forever, and then your offset is a 12-year life unless someone changes that. Like what if you don't keep buying Teslas and you go back to ICE vehicles? Well, you don't get an infinite benefit of that first ICE that first EV that was bought. And so you talk about where the market is, like where the effectiveness is. And I think that's where Max is going on some of the cap and trade and effectiveness of it. Can you convince us that this is actually an effective market and people ought to be involved just because of that?
Yeah, I think going back to my first point of trying not to conflate allowances and offsets, right? Like in California, offsets represent a small portion of what can be used for compliance obligations. And, there's something in California called the IMAC, which is an Independent Market Advisory Committee. And they want to essentially not do away with offsets, but really put the clamps on how they're able to, offset emissions that are regulated under the program.
Makes sense to me. I mean, that would be
Yeah, like, in California, the forestry offsets, let's say every one offset issued, you have to put one in a buffer pool. Well, the forest fires have destroyed, a meaningful portion of that buffer pool.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at it a couple of years, who's to say where those emissions reductions are actually coming from instead? Looking at the kind of total addressable market size that you're talking about, do I think we ever get every ton regulated? Certainly not. But, does that also mean that there are opportunities to generate these instruments and, have them serve as a kind of finding the lowest cost of avoided emissions or reduced emissions? Yeah, I think it is certainly an important matter of efficiency there.
I was going to ask you this because I think this segues into the CCUS stuff because I've done some work in that space a little bit trying to understand it. And that example that Hike gave on the electric compressors, I think it's like 700 Teslas per one of these units in terms of equivalent annually of what it would reduce in scope 1. And this company's putting out hundreds of them a year. So they're just blowing Tesla out of the water, right? And we looked at this company from a acquisition standpoint. We were working with some institutional investors, and the feedback was like overwhelmingly negative from the groups that at least our sponsor was talking to, or at least that's what the feedback we got, which was, this is perpetuating carbon. This is not going to end carbon. This is actually going to make it easy. Basically it was just a lot of these things. And these were a lot of West Coast and East Coast type institutions. Won't pick out specifically who they are, even though I know, but basically they just were real negative on it. And they didn't want to be involved with the transaction. And so it was like, okay, we've got a way now to do quick win. Like we can, reduce a ton of this stuff. And ultimately it did get funded, and a private equity group came in, and they're going to do really well on this asset, not just from an environmental emissions reduction standpoint, but just this is a good company. Are those kind of sentiments around some things that might work well, but because they maybe help one industry, like the oil and gas industry, it's resisted? And I don't know if you even can answer that, but I've seen it also in CCUS, and that's where I'm leading this, is like some of the things I see in the 45Qs, it's like, seems like it's not really going to help certain industries, like oil and gas, for example, where you've got a bunch of small emission sources, and there's really not a good way to aggregate those and get the credits. I don't know. Just your thoughts on that in general.
Yeah, I mean, at least certainly in the voluntary space, I think we're already seeing, and Hike, I know we've talked about this before, is two different types of demand curves developing, where you have buyers, large corporates who are willing to pay hundreds of dollars per ton.
Wow.
For an instrument that they know has 100-year plus sequestration capability, whether that's a bio oil that's been injected, or hard capture like CCUS type, versus cook stove projects in some country,
right,
far corner of the world. So some corporates won't buy those, and then on the other side you have demand that'll just be kind of a box checker that is willing to buy it and say, yes, we reduced our emissions. So I think it's definitely a matter of who you're talking to and perspective and interest in Heck, I don't know if you're gonna.
No, I think it's right. Like if you just kind of think about the what's happening from an investable market standpoint, and I think one thing that Nick said is most of the value traded is actually in the strategics, if you want to use a banking type word. It's in the company side, not in the market side. But you really, if you go back, why this is so interesting to me is 2005 you had, I think it's 9 or so carbon pricing regimes. Now we're north of 60, and that could double again as you think globally. And it isn't. There are pricing mechanisms in Asia already, like China already. Like the thing that is everybody, Max, I think maybe you're going with the angle of is it just a Western world OECD tax that's being put on? it isn't completely. So I do think there is, the visibility and the clarity in those markets isn't necessarily perfect, but that opportunity of kind of that global linkage is interesting.
What do you think about like on the CCUS side? How is it going to get any? I mean, maybe you don't know this. Again, I know you're more in this market side and what your firm does. But one question that I have as I looked at that space is it going to get easier to be able to capture things and get the credits? Because I felt like there was a lot of just kind of odd qualifiers. Like, for example, the amount at one site had to be above a certain amount. And if you looked at, like, for example, the oil and gas space, which is what I'm very familiar with, there's a ton of emissions all over the place in like places like the Permian or even the Haynesville with like CO2 treaters that are venting the CO2, right? But the way that the CCUS is, the credits are now, you can't really get, there's not big enough emission sources. And then I believe this was the case when I looked at it, maybe it's changed, but you weren't able to aggregate. And then there was also rules around the gatherer of these assets versus the emitter or the sequester. And so I just made it really difficult to make any projects work, even though I felt like there was a ton of low hanging fruit to go after and get after it if people wanted to capture.
To date, capture has been had much more of a role and kind of been more of an applicable concept in low carbon fuel standard market,
right?
Where you can reduce the carbon intensity through EOR or permanent sequestration and generate credits that way. In cap and trade markets, because of historically lower pricing, it hasn't been enough to incentivize the development of outright capture on any plans.
Sure.
And then, couple that with development challenges, timelines, et cetera. Like you look at any of the, plans announced in the California market for capture, they all have 5-year timelines. And, at most, we're talking 1 million tons on a big marquee project on a base of 380 million tons regulated per year. And so it's really hard to have, an impact, at least on the demand front. Like, when you talk about market risks, is there a silver bullet technology that just makes demand for these instruments go away? I think we all know that that's, not feasible near term. But that's something they're definitely looking at in the LCFS market, is how to have a kind of comprehensive CCUS strategy.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of like where solar was, before you had, power, purchase agreements and PPAs that then could be underwritten to then provide financing for solar projects. Like part of the issue in the carbon market is you don't really have, to use a midstream term, it's like you have a 12-year term on your 45Q credit. Well, could you get some sort of MVC or minimum volume commitment to then underwrite, that that capture, transport, and storage question and so like the financing structures aren't quite there yet. But what's interesting is we saw financing structures around tax equity monetizations, really emerge in the renewable space that seem to point the path for moving these projects forward, Max. And you really can't think about it, but like volume commitments around it. So it isn't just purely, it's just very, very early phase. And the one thing that I'd say is carbon generally in the fossil side is seen as an enabler for more, production. And that I think is the other thing of like why low carbon fuel credits were just easier for people to understand. It's like, well, that isn't causing more oil or natural gas to be produced. But what's going to be interesting as well is like you think about markets emerging. That's where I was going on. Like, you're in your neck of the woods, think about, the regional greenhouse gas initiative and the expansion of that with, maybe you could talk a little bit about that and kind of the expansion with Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and, where that market is today for the power side, and then how exactly you get to this, goal of clean energy and reduced emissions in the Northeast might be something that's worth talking about.
Yeah, definitely. Before jumping into Reggie, though, an interesting point kind of reminded me of, when you said CCUS reminds you somewhat of early days of renewables. carbon kind of has a role and deserves some credit in the renewable space. Coming out of the Kyoto and Clean Development Mechanism, a lot of the first projects were, early vintage projects were, hydro or wind in China, India, Turkey, etc. And that was the economic incentive, in addition to just, competitive pricing, but being able to monetize a credit for the environmental attributes associated with avoided emissions was, help finance and get these projects built at the time.
Okay.
And propel the technology, forward. So, and I think we'll see more of that as carbon kind of takes center stage again. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting developments going on in the RGGI market. It's currently 11 states. I'm sure that, some people have seen the news splash. Governor Youngkin has announced he's going to pull Virginia from the program. I won't share too many opinions on that, but it's a really, it's a long-standing program that's kind of stepped up where the federal government hasn't been able to implement similar programs, right? Around the time of Waxman-Markey, which was the attempt at a federal cap and trade bill. When that failed, carbon pricing was really relegated to the states, and RGGI launched in 2009, sets a declining cap on power sector emissions right now, designed to reduce emissions 30% from 2020 levels by 2030. But something that's really interesting to look at is the last time this program was updated in 2017. If you compare the participating states' ambitions then in terms of renewables on grid, renewable penetration, and just economy-wide climate targets versus what's changed in the past 3 years, it's meaningfully moved higher. And you have to calibrate the program accordingly. It doesn't benefit anyone to have a slack program where emissions can just squish between states to kind of lowest cost. And so we kind of expect meaningful changes through the program. And these programs are all closely managed, right? Like I was kind of saying, it's interesting to have a commodity like carbon that kind of has clamps around it to become increasingly scarce. And something that we also haven't talked about is the alignment of cap and trade programs, right, for market participants and regulators, right? Each allowance sold at auction is dollars flowing back to the regulators for the implementation of efficiency projects or bill assistance for consumers and other climate programs. So you kind of have this, cyclical program where
feedback loop, essentially.
Exactly, where higher prices encourage, further spending on reducing emissions, and also, naturally
program. It's kind of a self-fulfilling prospect of in some of these markets is what is interesting to me. Yeah. It's just a question of what's the kickoff point, and I don't think it is. We've talked, and Dan Pickering and I've talked about this a lot in the past. It's really not an argument anymore around what's going on, from a climate standpoint or from an emissions standpoint, and it's really now just like what are the best solutions, and some of the improved visibility around offsets, like having real offsets that really do put carbon away for a long period of time, like improved market disclosures, and then really I'm not arguing for the global price of carbon, but I do think that you want the lowest priced to be the places that you go first because it's going to be the most efficient. And so that like these conversations I think have just illuminated people as financial markets become more aware of what's going on, and investors become more aware. I think there's going to be real opportunities to solve problems and have an impact. So appreciate you coming on. I don't know if you had any closing thoughts of where people can reach you or where you can be. I know we're trying to keep these to 45 minutes or so we've got a few max if you had any additional questions, but I wanted to give you the opportunity to plug your business and plug where you guys are coming from.
Before you get to that,
I was
just going to say thank you. And I think that it's really interesting. And to me, regardless of, I mean, I don't care what your opinion is on what you think the future of carbon is. I think that the fact that you're as educated as you are on it, you guys are playing in this space is smart, because I don't think it's going away, these talking points. And the reality is it's going to touch most industries, right? So I think it's, congrats to you guys on what you're doing. And I think that getting smart on this is a big deal. And so I would love to catch up again in the future. And this is something I'd like to check in on these things and just kind of monitor it, because I have very little knowledge in the space.
Yeah, well, we pride ourselves on being carbon nerds. Always happy to talk shop on anything traditional energy to the niche corners of voluntary. Molecule-ventures.com, easiest way to get us. Nick at Molecule-Ventures as well. And yeah, look forward to keeping in touch with you both and hopefully chatting again soon. It's been great.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Nick.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Nick.
Thanks, guys.
Have a good weekend. See you.
You as well. Take care.
Bye, everybody.